Take 4. Analogical superstructure model. The essential postulate of the structural model affirms that a cylindrical link of the axial planes in the cultural structure as a model of the entity's truth nociologically corresponds to a stratiform ontic sphere as a model of the entity's design. The potential postulate, potential, P-A-T, the potential postulate of the structural model affirms that a simple spherical ontic node of the superstructure as a model of the essential matrix emerging in the cultural object axiologically corresponds to a horizontal plane of the cylindrical bond of the cultural structure as a model of the habitual concept. The joint comprehension of both postulates reveals to us an important condition. A node in the cultural structure model corresponds to a bond in the superstructure model. This condition determines that between both models exists a relationship of inverse symmetry. Now, there is an actual characteristic common to cultural objects and to conscious representations of cultural objects, which cannot be absent in the respective models. The incorporation of this characteristic imposes a visual criterion in the qualification of the indicated relationship, which is why the Hyperborean wisdom denominates it inverse potential symmetry, potential, P-A-T. Examination of Figure 74 clearly demonstrates such a common characteristic. Both the habitual concept and the cultural object present in common the quality that their existence is associated to their appearance. The habitual concept, or any concept slice, only exists for the animic subject when it is noted, when its significance becomes visible, when its representation emerges into the light sphere. Light sphere is the astral plane, etc. The cultural object, on the other hand, only exists as such when it is reknown. An example, when its cultural value is evident to the members of the cultural community. The existence of a cultural object consists in its appearing full of meaning or in its being evident. Thus, we see that despite the fact that one corresponds to a bond and the other to a node, both beings present the common characteristic of their patent existence. The methodological rigor demands that the actual qualities be contemplated in the structural models so that they correspond as exactly as possible with the reality that they represent. The mentioned characteristic must, then, be present in the cultural structure model and in the superstructure model. So we are going to implicitly assume the manifest visibility of the habitual concept and the cultural object represented in the respective models. Both the concept slice of the cylindrical bond of the cultural structure and the node of the superstructure must be considered patent. The first patent for the intelligible apprehension of the animic subject, and the second patent for the sensitive perception of the passu. Passu means animal man. Thus, between the two models, a relationship of inverse potential symmetry will be verified. A structure model like that of Figure 12 is made up of nodes and bonds. We know that from the potential postulate that the nodes of the superstructure consist of cultural objects and that the same can be represented in a model by equivalent spheres. It is evident, then, that we still need to clarify how the bonds of the superstructure model are represented. The answer will arise from the comprehension of the actual bonds of the superstructures. That is to say, from the following inquiry: what links the nodes or cultural objects of the actual superstructure to each other? Answer: a particular relative bonding, which Hyperborean wisdom denominates connection of meaning. The set of cultural objects that populates a given cultural space constitutes an axiological context in which the particular object acquires its meaning. This implies that each cultural object is linked to each one of the remaining objects of the axiological context by a culturally permanent connection of meaning. As long as a cultural object exists as such, an example, as long as it possesses meaning for a Pasu culture, the connections of meaning that cause its evidence in the axiological context will be maintained. And as a Pasu culture is no more than the form determined by an actual superstructure, it is understood that its bonds can only consist of such connections of meaning that bind together the cultural objects of the axiological context. Now, if the connections of meaning are the actual links between cultural objects, it only remains for us to establish the form of their representation in the superstructure model. Excuse me. The connections of meaning, because of their permanent and actual linking characteristic between cultural objects, must be qualified as macrocosmic records. As defined on page 540, a macrocosmic record is any structural container capable of receiving and preserving the form of a given fact and of enabling its subsequent reproduction by the demiurge. As we will see later on, the connections of meaning fulfill this function because they contain the cultural history of the object of reference. That is why the Hyperborean wisdom denominates them cultural records. Unlike the ontic records, which are the exclusive property of individual entities, on page 541, the cultural records are always the property of two cultural objects, those between which the connection of meaning exists. But two cultural objects being founded on two spatially distant entities, and the connection of meaning being an actual link between them, it is clear that the cultural record has to extend directly from one cultural object to the other, covering the cultural space that separates them. This actual quality of the cultural record is the principle that justifies its analogical representation as a cylindrical bond in the superstructure model. The connection of meaning which links two cultural objects of the actual superstructure can be analogically represented as a cylindrical bond that links two spherical nodes in the superstructure model. We are already in a position to represent such a model. Undoubtedly, the model of Figure 12 would adequately serve for this purpose were it not for the fact that it is not at all suitable to represent the superstructure independently of the cultural structure. On the contrary, it would be highly instructive to refer the superstructure model to the cultural structure model, since this would bring out the inverse potential symmetry that exists between the two. This possibility can be realized by representing in the same figure the two structures according to the model of Figure 12, as shown in Figure 75. There we can see that both the superstructure model on the left and the cultural structure model on the right are identical to the structure model on Figure 12. However, a relationship of inverse potential symmetry is verified between the two. In the cultural structure, the place of the nodes is occupied by principles, the passive potency of which makes them invisible to the animic subject. As we saw in the first part, the principles are unrepresentable. On the contrary, the place of the bonds is occupied by relationships, the active potency of which enables their conscious representation whenever the subject requires it. The relationships are, in any case, visible to the animic subject. In the superstructure, the place of the nodes is occupied by cultural objects, the meaning of which makes them visible to the members of the socio-cultural community. On the contrary, in the place of the bonds exist the cultural records, the connections of meaning that are invisible because they remain under the threshold of meaning. See Figure 39. The inverse potential symmetry is evident In the cultural structure, the nodes are invisible, and in the superstructure, the nodes are visible. In the cultural structure, the bonds are visible, and in the superstructure, the bonds are invisible. Analogical study of the superstructures. The superstructure model, elaborated in the previous articles and shown graphically in Figure 75, makes possible the analogical vision of the actual superstructures that we had proposed to obtain at the beginning of this section. From now on, when referring to the actual superstructures, we will always do so through this model or taking into account the conclusions drawn from it. Particularly valuable, for example, is the collaboration that the model lends to a detailed explanation of the concept of the cultural record, a concept that can only be explained analogically, since the cultural record is invisible to the animic subject. The Hyperborean initiate, however, has the faculty of anamnesis at his disposal, which enables him to explore the cultural records and to know the history of the cultural objects of reference. In order to evidence the power of this faculty to non-initiated viryas, for whom the cultural records are effectively invisible, it will be inevitable to resort to the superstructure model in order to explain, beforehand, the cultural record concept. This is what we will do next. In the present article, we will explain the cultural record concept with the help of the model in Figure 75. In the next one, we will study the Hyperborean initiate's faculty of anamnesis. 1. Analogical correspondence between the superstructure model and the actual superstructure. The superstructure model being an analogical representation of the actual superstructure, the conclusions that we can draw from its examination will present correspondences with characteristics, qualities, or properties of it. The principal correspondences have been synthesized in the table of Figure 76. The first step will be to explain each one of such relationships in order to clarify the context in which the cultural record concept must be understood. The 9 statements in the right-hand column refer to the model of the superstructure in Figure 75, while the 9 on the left-hand column reflect corresponding properties of an actual superstructure. The first 3 correspondences can be considered as axiomatic principles of the superstructure model. These principles have already been sufficiently explained and justified in the preceding articles, so that here, except for 3, we will only limit ourselves to repeating their definition. Principle 1 is the fundamental thesis of the superstructure model, from which all subsequent reasonings are derived. It affirms simply that the superstructure model analogically corresponds with every actual superstructure. Principle 2 expresses the potential postulate of the structural model, and its axiomatic character is evident. It affirms that a cultural object of the actual superstructure model corresponds to a node of the superstructure model. Principle 3 receives its actual foundation in the connections of meaning that link cultural objects to each other. As such relationships give rise to cultural records, without discussing the validity of the principle, it will be explained again in greater detail further on. Its formulation affirms that a bond of the superstructure model corresponds with a cultural record of the actual superstructure. Assuming the validity of the axiomatic principles 1, 2, and 3, on which the superstructure model is based, the analysis of the following analogical propositions will enable us to deepen our comprehension of actual superstructures. These are now logically enchained statements that describe the essential properties of the superstructure model and enable us to explain the constitution of an actual superstructure. Propositions 4 and 5. Let us recall what was said on page 60 about the structure model in Figure 12, identical to that in Figure 75. We deduce from simple observation that it is comprised of 4 elements: certain protuberances called nodes at the vertexes and center of the cube, the bond between the nodes, the space that occupies its extension, and the time that allows it to last or change. Here, of these four elements, we will not consider time, which in the actual superstructures is denominated history, or historical time, since it has already been defined in another section, page 359, as time of an external culture. Instead, later on, we will study a temporal species proper to the cultural records that Hyperborean wisdom denominates as chronocultural series. Disregarding time, we can affirm that a superstructure model is essentially constructed with topological elements organized in a topological space. In this topological space, we recognize the space that every structure requires in order to exist. But in place of the nodes and bonds, we affirm that a superstructure model is constructed with topological elements. What does this difference signify? Answer: that in an actual superstructure, cultural objects analogous to nodes and cultural records analogous to bonds are actual elements, the existence of which begins a posteriori to ontic existence, as we saw in C. The designated external entities are the support of the cultural object's cultural properties. This is why the entities present their design a priori in the first movement, while the cultural objects arise by a posteriori affirmation of the design's essential matrix during the second movement. Therefore, in the superstructure model, there must exist, analogically, something a priori to the existence of the nodes and bonds, but which serves as a fundament for the subsequent properties of the nodes and bonds. Such a fundamental a priority is the essential characteristic of the topological elements of the superstructure model. Proposition 5 is understood then, which postulates the analogy between topological elements of the superstructure model and the designated entities of the actual superstructure. Moreover, if the topological elements are organized in a topological space, and those are analogous to the designated entities, the existence of which occurs in physical space, it is evidence that these spaces are also analogous. This is what Proposition 4 affirms. The topological space of the superstructure model is analogous to the physical space of the actual superstructure. Propositions 6 and 7. Let us now consider the structure of Let us now consider the structure model of Figure 12. The topological elements, when organized in the topological space, form a topological infrastructure. The topological infrastructure is the essential skeleton of any structure. On this skeleton are added, a posteriori, the values that transform the infrastructure into a structure and confer to it specific geometric properties. Node or bond qualification, for example, is the adjudication of a geometric value to certain pre-existing topological elements in the structure. In other words, the topological infrastructure supports the geometric properties of the structure. Applying these definitions to the superstructure model of Figure 75 and tracing correspondences to the actual superstructure, we come to understand Proposition 6. In effect, if the topological infrastructure is comprised of topological elements, analogous to the designated entities, these have to make up, analogously, an ontic infrastructure. That is to say, the designated entities, by organizing themselves in physical space, form an ontic infrastructure. Naturally, as Proposition 6 declares, the topological infrastructure of the superstructure model is analogous to the ontic infrastructure of the actual superstructure. Now, what is an ontic infrastructure? Really? Answer: the essential skeleton that supports the cultural properties of the actual superstructure. Let's explain this answer. The designated entities, which are distributed in the physical space, form an ontic infrastructure. The passu gets to know its designs by means of the first movement, and is affirming its essential matrices with the projection of the signs that the second movement carries out. Thus, the entities are transformed into cultural objects and emerge with specific properties beyond the threshold of meaning. In truth, the entities remain equilibrated in their place, since what emerges is an axiological content placed in them by the expression of the passu. This axiological content is a cultural value added to the pre-existing entities that, for this reason, act as a support of cultural properties. It is understood then that, analogously to the superstructure model, the ontic infrastructure is an essential skeleton of the actual superstructure. On this skeleton are added a posteriori the values that transform the infrastructure into a superstructure and confer to it specific cultural properties. The qualification of cultural object or cultural record, for example, is the adjudication of a cultural value to certain pre-existing designated entities. In other words, the ontic infrastructure supports the cultural properties of the actual superstructure. It is evident now, the statement of Proposition 7. The geometric value added to an element of the topological infrastructure is analogous to the cultural value affirmed on an entity of ontic infrastructure. Okay. Fast. Proposition 8. The topological space within which the topological infrastructure is organized is an essentially qualitative space. An example, a space in which the topological elements can only be qualified by the quality of their essential properties. The addition of geometric value to the elements of the topological infrastructure transforms the topological space into a geometrical space, an essentially quantitative space where takes place the superstructure model. An example, a space where nodes and bonds can be qualified by their quantity, number, or measure. In the geometric space, the nodes and bonds acquire particular importance by their relative position in the superstructure model. They can be numbered, counted, and their mutual relationships measured with precision. Analogously, physical space is an essentially qualitative space. An example, a space in which only designated entities can be qualified by the quality of their essential properties. Such purely qualitative properties, of course, consist in the plan of ontic designs. The affirmation of the essential matrices due to the effect of the second movement transforms the designated entities into cultural objects and the ontic's infrastructure into a superstructure. Physical space is then transformed into cultural space, a qualitative space where the meaning of each cultural object rigorously depends on its own cultural value and on the measure of mutual connections of meaning. The general characteristic of cultural space have been summarized in the 14th commentary of Article A. Clearly, Proposition 8 synthesizes the correspondence between geometric space and cultural space. This is the complete statement. The geometric space determined by the superstructure model is analogous to the cultural space constituted by the actual superstructure. We have reviewed up to here propositions 1 to 8. Proposition 9, however, cannot be addressed because its explanation requires the definition of some previous concepts. In the following subarticles, we will study the relationship between the infrastructure and the structure, and the relativity of the geometric value. These concepts will enable us to define the geometric context of a property, and this ultimately will make Proposition 9 comprehensible. Thank you. Stay tuned. Test number 1, May 17th, 11:05 p.m. Test number 1.